The story of Montpelier begins long before its brick walls rose over the Virginia foothills, back when the land itself was still untamed, unsettled, and waiting for the ambitions of one family to shape it. In the early 18th century, the Madison lineage stepped onto a vast stretch of Piedmont countryside that seemed to promise both prosperity and peril in equal measure. When Ambrose Madison and his brother-in-law secured their enormous patent, the acreage was little more than rolling wilderness, where dense forests met fertile soil and the blue shadow of the mountains lingered on the horizon. Yet this untouched landscape held the makings of something grand, and the Madisons set out to transform it into a working plantation that could support a rising dynasty. The first structures that appeared on the property were modest, timber outbuildings and simple quarters meant to shelter the earliest labor force. These individuals, forcibly brought into the Madison household, became the foundation on which every later addition to the estate would rest. Their hands shaped the soil, cleared the forests, planted tobacco, carved paths, and erected the first cabins. What began as Mount Pleasant, a small frontier settlement, gradually evolved into a functioning plantation where the rhythms of agriculture began to replace the wilderness. The land responded quickly. Fertile rows of crops pushed upward, and livestock spread across newly fenced fields. Every season tightened the bond between the Madison family and this expanding domain. Ambrose Madison oversaw this transformation with a strict, commanding presence. Accounts from the period describe a man whose determination to establish a prosperous estate was matched only by the severity with which he enforced discipline. Under his direction, Mount Pleasant grew larger, more organized, and more dependent on the enslaved community that sustained every facet of its daily operations. The property's future grandeur was still unimaginable, yet the essential framework, social, economic, and architectural, was being laid with each passing year. The plantation was becoming a self-contained world, one where power flowed from the house outward and labor flowed from the fields inward. But just as the foundations of this world seemed secure, an unexpected event cast a shadow over the rising estate. After only a short period of living on the land he had worked so fiercely to tame, Ambrose suddenly became gravely ill under circumstances the court later deemed suspicious. Rumors moved quietly between households, carried in whispers by those who lived closest to the center of the plantation's hierarchy. The official inquiry suggested that several enslaved individuals had been accused of causing his decline, an allegation that would leave a lasting mark on the reputation of the estate. The tension that spread across Mount Pleasant in the aftermath seeped into its very identity, fusing the triumph of new beginnings with an unease that would linger for generations. Although the details of that moment remain clouded by time, one thing is clear. Montpelier was born from a mixture of ambition and uncertainty, shaped by the hands of many and shadowed early by a mystery that would quietly echo through the walls of every home built afterward. And as the Madison family continued to grow their plantation, expanding both its physical presence and its influence, no one could yet imagine how profoundly this land, and those bound to it, would shape the history of a future nation. By the time James Madison Sr. assumed control of the growing plantation, the land had already begun to reveal its potential. Yet, he envisioned something far more enduring than scattered outbuildings and modest wooden structures. He sought a residence that would not merely shelter his expanding household, but proclaim permanence, stability, and rising influence. With this ambition, he initiated the construction of a substantial brick home around 1764. A rare architectural statement in rural Virginia, where timber still dominated the landscape. The house rose in a Flemish bond pattern, each brick laid with precise craftsmanship that hinted at the family's aspirations. Its 2 stories, symmetrical form, and hipped roof announced a shift from frontier practicality to a new era of refinement. For the first time on this land, there stood a building not meant to survive only a single generation, but to anchor a dynasty. From its windows, one could look across the fields and see the transformation taking shape. Tobacco rows stretching toward the horizon, workshops expanding, and new quarters appearing to support the estate's growing operations. Inside, the layout revealed the rhythms of a large and evolving family. Children filled the rooms with constant activity, and relatives arrived frequently, finding in the brick walls both safety and status. Daily life blended domestic warmth with the steady flow of plantation business, all under the direction of Madison Sr., who valued order and productivity. As the family grew, so did the need for additional space. Storage areas expanded, workrooms multiplied, and new service structures appeared just beyond the main house. Every addition strengthened the estate's role as the administrative heart of a complex agricultural world. Yet, even as the house settled into its new identity, it was clear that its story was only beginning. The young boy who roamed its halls, James Madison Jr., watched artisans shape the walls, listened to family discussions about politics and land, and absorbed the rhythms of a place that would one day define him as profoundly as he would define it. With each passing year, the plantation's center of gravity shifted increasingly toward the brick residence, which stood taller and more confident than anything the Madisons had built before. What had begun as a practical dwelling was slowly becoming the symbolic core of the entire property. It would witness the rise of a future president, host generations of celebrations and hardships, and undergo expansions that mirrored the ambitions of its owners. And while no one yet knew how deeply the house would intertwine with the nation's history, the stage had already been set. Montpellier's story would unfold not only across fields and forests, but within the very rooms whose walls were now settling into place. From the moment James Madison entered the world, Montpelier shaped him as surely as he would one day reshape the country. The brick house his father built became more than a home. It was a living classroom, a refuge, and at times an unforgiving mirror of the society surrounding him. Its rooms carried the mixture of privilege and responsibility that defined elite Virginia families, while its grounds revealed the stark divisions of labor that powered the plantation. Growing up within this environment, the young Madison absorbed the rhythms of a world in which ideas and contradictions existed side by side. The house itself provided his earliest impressions of order and structure. Its symmetrical design, carefully arranged spaces, and deliberate proportions echoed the Enlightenment thinking that would later captivate him. He spent long hours in quiet rooms surrounded by books, often under the guidance of his intellectual mother, Nellie. The library became his sanctuary, the place where he first encountered ancient philosophies, political theory, and the writings that would eventually inspire his contributions to the Constitution. Outside his window, the plantation unfolded as a vast, interconnected network of fields, workshops, and quarters, an ever-present reminder of the human systems that kept the household running. As the family expanded, Montpelier expanded with them. Additional outbuildings appeared across the grounds, and the flow of daily work grew more complex. Madison witnessed how his father managed not only the agricultural operations, but the lives of dozens of people bound to the estate. Though he was insulated from the hardest realities of plantation life, the young Madison could not ignore the contrast between the quiet interior spaces where he read and the demanding labor occurring just beyond the garden wall. This contrast left a mark on him, prompting questions that would later influence his political thinking even if the contradictions remained unresolved during his lifetime. Friends and tutors visited frequently, filling the house with conversations about law, philosophy, and religion. These discussions shaped Madison's analytical mind and sharpened his curiosity about how societies function and how power is distributed. Even as a teenager, he was restless for broader horizons, sensing that Montpelier, while comfortable and intellectually stimulating, was only the beginning of his journey. Yet each time he returned from his early studies, he found the house subtly changed, a new room furnished, a garden expanded, another layer of refinement added by his ambitious father. By the time he reached adulthood, Montpelier had become deeply intertwined with his identity. It was where he drafted his earliest reflections, where he gained the discipline that would define his political career, and where he learned to balance introspection with action. When he ventured into public life, the house seemed to wait for him, its foundations quietly recording each stage of his development. Years later, after rising to national prominence and meeting the vibrant young widow who would become his wife, Madison returned to Montpelier with Dolly by his side. Their arrival marked not only the beginning of a new chapter for the couple, but also the beginning of the most ambitious transformation the house had ever undergone, an expansion that would turn it from a distinguished family residence into a symbol recognizable across the emerging nation. When James Madison returned to Montpelier with Dolly, the house he had known since childhood suddenly felt too small for the life that awaited them. He was no longer the quiet young scholar wandering its halls. He was a rising statesman of the new republic, a figure whose home needed to match both his public responsibilities and the elegance Dolly naturally brought into every room she entered. The estate, once a symbol of his father's ambitions, was now entering an era shaped by his own vision, an era defined by expansion, refinement, and an unmistakable sense of purpose. Between 1797 and 1800, Montpelier transformed more dramatically than at any other moment in its early history. What had once been a sturdy brick house began unfolding into a residence that carried the air of a small palace. Madison oversaw the addition of a 30-foot portico, a grand architectural gesture that altered not just the facade but the entire presence of the estate. Visitors approaching the house no longer encountered a simple plantation dwelling. Instead, they were met by a dignified structure with classical symmetry and an elevated stance, suggesting the influence of ancient ideals Madison admired. The portico served not only as a decorative flourish, but as a declaration that Montpelier was at last stepping into the world of American political identity. Beneath its columns, guests would soon gather for spirited debates, private discussions, and conversations that blended personal life with national concerns. The structure cast long shadows across the front lawn at dusk, hinting at the dual nature of the home now taking shape. Part domestic sanctuary, part quiet extension of the political sphere in which Madison operated. Inside, the renovations were equally ambitious. Rooms were widened and elongated, ceilings raised, and circulation patterns reimagined to accommodate larger gatherings. Dolly began shaping interiors in her lively, welcoming style, balancing elegance with comfort. The couple envisioned a home where statesmen, thinkers, and friends could mingle in brightly lit rooms, where ideas flowed as freely as the fresh air drifting in from the gardens just outside. Craftsmen introduced finer materials, new finishes, and carefully carved details that subtly enhanced the sophistication of every space. The changes extended across the grounds as well. Pathways were redirected, gardens expanded, and vistas opened to reveal long views toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. These sweeping landscapes offered a sense of openness and serenity, but beneath their beauty lay the unspoken truth of the labor required to maintain them. The people whose hands shaped every hedge and tilled every field remained invisible in the official portraits of the estate, yet their presence defined the very structure of Montpelier's growth. By the early months of 1800, the house had taken on a new identity, still recognizable to those who had known it before, yet undeniably elevated. It projected authority without ostentation, refinement without excess. It was a place where domestic life intertwined seamlessly with the responsibilities of a public figure whose influence was growing with each passing year. But even as Montpelier reached this new architectural peak, unseen pressures were beginning to gather beyond its tranquil exterior. The world Madison inhabited was shifting. Tensions were rising within the young nation, and the choices he would soon make as a leader promised to ripple back through these very rooms. The elegant portico that welcomed guests would also stand witness to moments of uncertainty, ambition, and private struggles that history would never fully record. Montpelier was no longer simply a family home. It had become the stage on which visible triumphs and hidden dramas would unfold, each event leaving its mark on the walls that continued to rise and reshape themselves around the lives inside. As Montpelier entered the 19th century, its outward grandeur was matched by a rich and complex interior world. Behind the refined facade lay a network of rooms, corridors, and service spaces that revealed not only the tastes of James and Dolly Madison, but also the intricate social hierarchy that sustained their household. Every chamber had a role, every doorway carried significance, and every movement, from the quiet steps of enslaved workers to the practiced hospitality of Dolly, contributed to the choreography of life inside the estate. The renovations introduced a series of elegant new rooms designed for conversation, contemplation, and formal gatherings. Sunlight filtered through large windows into parlors where carved mantels framed lively fires on winter evenings. Walls were covered with bright pigments and fine wallpaper, chosen with Dolly's eye for color and harmony. The dining room became a centerpiece of the home, a place where meals doubled as political engagements, where Madison discussed philosophy, governance, and world events with visitors who traveled long distances to sit at his table. Beyond the public spaces lay quieter chambers intended for rest, private discussions, and the daily rhythms of family life. Study rooms filled with books reflected Madison's disciplined habits. He often retreated into these spaces to read and write, drawing on the intellectual foundation built during his youth. In contrast, Dolly animated the social heart of the house, guiding guests through rooms arranged to feel lively yet welcoming. Her influence softened the formality of the architecture, making Montpelier a place where people felt at ease sharing ideas that might later shape public policy. But the true structure of Montpelier extended far beyond what visiting eyes ever saw. Hidden passages, workrooms, and service corridors formed an invisible architecture designed for efficiency and control. These areas connected the kitchen to the dining room, the storerooms to the main hall, and the cellars to both wings of the estate. Enslaved workers moved through these routes with precision, performing countless tasks that allowed the household to function seamlessly. Their presence, though rarely acknowledged by guests, was essential to every polished moment the Madisons offered to the outside world. The kitchen complex operated almost like a small workshop, filled with the clatter of iron tools, the heat of brick hearths, and the steady coordination required to prepare meals for both family and visitors. Laundry spaces, storage cellars, and work yards buzzed with activity from dawn until well after nightfall. The plantation's internal organization mirrored a finely tuned system, one built on the labor of individuals whose names seldom appeared in the historical documents that praised the estate's beauty. The contrast between the refined interiors and the demanding work unfolding behind the scenes created a layered reality within Montpelier. On one side, polished mahogany tables, candlelit gatherings, and quiet intellectual exchanges. On the other, the relentless physical effort required to sustain such elegance. Yet both worlds existed within the same house, separated only by a thin wall or a silent corridor. Amid this environment, a young boy observed everything with perceptive eyes. Paul Jennings, born into the enslaved community at Montpelier, spent his earliest years navigating the spaces that most visitors never noticed. While his duties at first were simple, he increasingly found himself drawn into the core of the household's operations, where he witnessed conversations, routines, and customs that would influence his later path. Moving quietly between the rooms that defined the Madisons' daily life, he became familiar with the rhythms of the home in a way few others could match. No one yet imagined how profoundly this child, learning the house from its grand portico down to its most hidden corridors, would one day shape the legacy of Montpelier itself. When James Madison accepted the role of president in 1809, Montpelier did not simply fade into the background of his new political life. In many ways, the estate followed him to Washington, not physically, but through the habits, people, and expectations shaped within its walls. For Paul Jennings, who had grown up observing the rhythms of the house and the structured hierarchy that governed every movement, the transition from Montpelier to the White House felt less like entering a new world and more like stepping into a larger, intensified version of the one he already understood. Paul was only 10 when he was selected to accompany the Madison household to Washington. His early life at Montpelier had prepared him for this moment. He had learned to read subtle cues, anticipate needs before they were voiced, and navigate the boundaries between public formality and private routine. These skills, honed in the refined yet tightly organized spaces of Montpelier, translated seamlessly into the demands of the presidential residence, where timing, discretion, and a quiet awareness of political currents were essential. The White House in those years was far from the iconic structure recognized today. It needed constant tending, and its ceremonial spaces functioned much like the grand rooms at Montpelier, only on a scale shaped by national expectations. Paul found himself responsible for tasks requiring both trust and careful attention. He helped prepare gatherings, ensured that official dinners unfolded without interruption, and assisted Madison directly in ways that mirrored the routines of the plantation, though now under the pressure of government life. What truly set Paul apart was his ability to move silently but meaningfully through the house, understanding its invisible channels just as he had understood those of Montpelier. He became the quiet link between the private and public spheres of the president's daily existence, providing support during moments of calm and turmoil alike. His familiarity with structured households, where every room had purpose and every transition mattered, allowed him to navigate the White House with a confidence unusual for someone so young. This connection between the two homes became even clearer during the turbulent events of 1814. When British forces advanced on Washington, panic shook the capital. As officials scrambled to evacuate, Paul and several others remained inside the White House, acting instinctively on the discipline they had learned at Montpelier. While the city fell into chaos, they worked swiftly to gather important documents, valuables, and irreplaceable artifacts, including the now famous portrait of George Washington. In those frantic moments, the steady training of Montpellier's interior world guided Paul's choices. He knew how to operate under urgent pressure, how to prioritize tasks without hesitation, and how to maintain composure when order collapsed around him. After the crisis passed and Madison's presidency continued, Paul's responsibilities deepened. He became more than a household worker. He was a trusted attendant who had witnessed history unfolding from within its most intimate spaces. His experiences inside the nation's executive home sharpened his understanding of power and its contradictions. Yet, even as he adapted to this new environment, Montpelier remained a constant anchor in his life. Its memories lingered in the way he approached service, in the way he handled delicate tasks, and in the way he observed the interactions between people of influence. For Paul, the White House was never simply a workplace. It was an extension of the world he had grown up in, larger, louder, more exposed, but ultimately built upon the same structures of authority and expectation he had long studied from the edges of Montpellier's formal rooms. And after Madison's second term ended, the journey did not conclude in Washington. The presidential household would soon gather its belongings, step out of the capital's political arena, and return once more to the Virginia estate, where both Madison's and Paul Jennings's stories had begun, setting the stage for an entirely new chapter in the life of Montpelier and the people who shaped it. When the Madison household returned to Montpelier in 1817, the estate welcomed them with a mixture of familiarity and transformation. Years of public life had changed the rhythm of the family, and the house itself now seemed ready to evolve once again. The expansions completed before the presidency were only the beginning. Madison, older but no less intellectually driven, envisioned a residence suited to a quieter, yet still purposeful chapter of his life. Dolly, with her gift for hospitality, prepared the estate to receive an unending procession of visitors who sought the former president's counsel, or simply wished to witness the home of a man whose ideas had shaped a nation. Montpelier, once a stately plantation residence, began to take on the character of a small retreat for political thinkers. New one-story wings extended from both ends of the house, creating separate quarters for the Madisons and their guests. The larger drawing room, added during the final expansion phase, became the heart of the home, a warm, light-filled space where discussions on governance, agriculture, philosophy, and the future of the country unfolded late into the evening. These were not the loud debates of Washington's halls, but intimate, searching conversations shaped by years of experience and reflection. Inside, the house settled into a gentler rhythm. The pace of life slowed, but the estate remained busy. Scholars, statesmen, travelers, and friends arrived regularly, each bringing news from the broader world. They walked beneath the long portico, crossed polished floors, and found Madison surrounded by manuscripts, correspondence, and notes carefully organized across his study. Even in retirement, he continued refining ideas he had nurtured since youth, often pausing to step outside and gaze at the rolling slopes and distant mountains that framed the property. Dolly, ever the gracious host, sustained the lively atmosphere, ensuring Montpelier remained a center of social and intellectual life. Beyond the formal rooms, the estate's workspaces continued their constant motion. Enslaved workers maintained the house, cultivated the fields, and supported the flow of visitors in ways that made the refined calm of the interior possible. Their labor shaped every path, garden, and domestic routine. Montpelier was serene for those who lived at its center, but the quiet elegance of the home was made possible only by the continuous effort unfolding behind its walls and beyond its thresholds. Over time, the atmosphere of the estate shifted. The country Madison had helped design grew and changed rapidly, and he watched the political landscape from a distance, sometimes with pride, sometimes with concern. The guests who visited him brought reports of new debates, new conflicts, and new interpretations of the founding principles he had once fought so hard to articulate. These conversations gave Montpelier an air of thoughtful gravity, a place where ideas were not merely exchanged but weighed, tested, and reconsidered. The house itself reflected this transition. Its spacious rooms, once bustling during Dolly's Washington years, now carried a quieter energy. The drawing room still filled with voices, but the gatherings were more intimate. The wings, designed to accommodate larger households, gradually softened into peaceful quarters. Gardens matured, pathways settled, and the estate's edges grew more still. Yet beneath this calm lay the subtle awareness that an era was slowly receding. Madison's presence, though still commanding, began to carry the weight of many years. He spent more time in his study, revisiting past correspondence, refining philosophical reflections, and speaking with a steady stream of younger visitors who sought his insights. The estate, in turn, seemed to fold gently around him, becoming less a stage for public life and more a sanctuary for contemplation. And as Montpelier moved deeper into this reflective chapter, the house stood quietly at the threshold of an inevitable turning point, one that would alter its future, shift its balance of power, and prepare it for the next generation of challenges awaiting beyond its peaceful Virginia hills. When James Madison's presence finally faded from Montpelier, the house seemed to exhale with him, as though a stabilizing force had quietly slipped away. What remained was a vast estate now carried almost entirely by Dolly. Once the charismatic center of Washington society, now a widow standing at the helm of a property whose demands grew heavier with every passing month. The home that had once radiated energy, conversation, and intellectual exchange began to shift into a slower, more fragile state, reflecting the strain placed on the woman now responsible for its future. Dolly was no stranger to adversity. She had survived difficult financial periods before, had navigated complex political circles with grace, and had rebuilt her life more than once. But Montpelier, with its sprawling fields, numerous structures, and large enslaved workforce, required resources and a level of upkeep far beyond what her declining finances could sustain. The once flourishing plantation, maintained for decades through the combined authority of 2 generations of Madisons, now became a daily struggle, a massive enterprise gradually slipping from control. Inside the house, subtle signs of strain began to appear. Rooms that once gleamed with polished surfaces and lively company now carried a muted stillness. Paint dulled, fabrics aged, unused guest spaces felt increasingly hollow. The maintenance that had once been performed with tight coordination by a full staff became more sporadic, constrained by diminishing means. Dolly, still possessing her renowned warmth, continued to receive visitors, but the gatherings were smaller, quieter, and tinged with the unspoken awareness that Montpelier was no longer the bustling center it had once been. Beyond the walls, the situation was even more precarious. Fields that had once produced steady yields struggled under inconsistent management. Repairs to fences, outbuildings, and workspaces were delayed longer each season. The enslaved community, whose labor supported every function of the estate, endured the weight of these changes most directly. Their workloads intensified as resources shrank, and the pressures of a failing plantation reshaped daily life in ways that underscored the growing instability of the entire enterprise. Debt pressed on Dolly from all sides. Madison's later years had been marked by financial strain, and in his absence, the burden fell squarely on her. She attempted to preserve the estate's dignity, maintaining its rituals and traditions, but the gap between Montpelier's grandeur and its true condition widened steadily. Papers accumulated on desks, unpaid notes, letters requesting extensions, correspondence with creditors, each one a reminder that the estate was drifting toward a breaking point. Socially, Dolly remained beloved, yet even her influence could not halt the estate's decline. Guests who once arrived to discuss national policy now found conversations centered on personal losses, reorganizing assets, and the overwhelming challenge of managing a home built for an earlier, more prosperous era. The woman who had once captivated Washington with her poise and brightness now faced a reality in which charm alone could not mend failing finances or rescue a deteriorating plantation. As the 1840s progressed, Montpellier's decline accelerated. Corners of the house grew quieter. Sections of the grounds were left untended. The proud symmetry of the estate began to feel less like a symbol of order and more like a reminder of what the Madisons had once achieved. The weight of responsibility pressed upon Dolly, not only emotionally, but physically, reshaping her life as drastically as time reshaped the home around her. Eventually, the truth became unavoidable. Montpelier could no longer remain in her hands. The property that had belonged to the Madison family for more than a century, through eras of growth, struggle, and national transformation, was now preparing for an unprecedented shift. For the first time since its foundation, the estate was poised to leave the lineage that had built its identity, expanded its walls, and defined its legacy. Once Montpelier slipped from the hands of the Madison family, the estate entered a long and unsettled passage through time, a wandering existence that stretched across decades and reshaped the house in ways no single vision could control. What had once been a unified plantation, directed by one family over generations, now became a property traded, altered, and repurposed as successive owners imposed their own needs, tastes, and limitations on the aging structure. Each new arrival attempted to stabilize the estate, yet each left behind a different imprint, creating a layered history that pulled Montpelier further from its original identity. The first transition came quickly after Dolly relinquished the estate, and the sale marked the beginning of a restless century. Owners arrived with optimism, convinced they could revive the plantation or reshape it into a profitable enterprise, yet the challenges they faced mirrored the ones that had already overwhelmed Dolly. The land demanded constant care, the buildings required continuous maintenance, and the sheer scale of the estate consumed financial resources faster than any single owner could replenish them. One owner tried to revitalize the agricultural output. Another turned his attention to modest structural repairs. A third viewed the estate as an investment to be held, sold, or traded, depending on the economic winds. None were able to restore Montpelier to the grandeur it once embodied. With each transition, the house endured new renovations. Some intended to modernize the property, others to simply keep it functional. But these changes gradually obscured the architectural clarity that James Madison Sr. and later his son had carefully shaped. Brick was covered with stucco in an attempt to freshen the appearance. Rooms were altered or repurposed without regard to historical context. Additions were built to suit the needs of the moment, ignoring the symmetry and proportional elegance that had defined the original design. Doors were moved, walls adjusted, and sections of the house expanded to accommodate new ambitions and tastes. Over time, the estate became a patchwork of eras, none fully aligned with the intentions of those who had first built it. The grounds experienced a similar fragmentation. Fences and fields were rearranged, outbuildings neglected or refurbished, depending on the priorities of each owner. Gardens that had once been carefully curated lost their formal structure. Pathways shifted, hedgerows thinned, and the once grand views toward the Blue Ridge Mountains became partially obscured by unchecked growth or altered land use. Visitors who had known the estate in Madison's time would scarcely have recognized its silhouette by the late 19th century. As the decades progressed, Montpelier came increasingly close to slipping into irreversible decline. Structural weaknesses began to surface as the original framework endured weather, time, and inconsistent care. Sections of the house needed strengthening, support beams and masonry showed signs of fatigue. Rooms once filled with conversation now echoed faintly, as though the house itself sensed the fragility of its condition. The estate's finances faltered again and again, leading to rushed decisions and hasty repairs that did little to preserve long-term stability. A sense of unease settled around the house, as though the estate were holding itself together by memory alone. Each new owner inherited not only a property, but also the mounting weight of unresolved neglect. The estate's identity blurred with every renovation. Its spirit stretched thin as the core of the original Montpelier receded under layers of change. The once prominent plantation house now hovered on the brink of obscurity, overshadowed by the very history that had once given it significance. By the time the 20th century approached, Montpellier's survival no longer seemed guaranteed. The estate had endured nearly 200 years of continuous transformation, some mindful, some careless, all contributing to a gradual erosion of its authenticity. It was a house searching for a custodian with the vision, resources, and commitment to rescue it from slipping permanently into the shadows of forgotten architecture. And as another era dawned, the estate stood at a crossroads, waiting for someone with enough determination to pull it back from the edge and restore its fractured identity before it disappeared into history altogether. Montpellier's long drift through uncertainty came to an abrupt halt when the DuPont family stepped onto the property in the early 20th century. Their arrival marked the beginning of a new era, one defined not by quiet preservation or modest adjustments, but by sweeping transformation on a scale the estate had never seen before. Where previous owners had struggled simply to maintain the aging structure, the DuPonts approached Montpelier with the ambition and resources to reshape it entirely, turning the once fading plantation house into a grand country estate fit for a family of immense wealth and influence. William and Annie Rogers DuPont were captivated not only by the setting, with its rolling pastures and mountain views, but also by the possibilities the property offered. To them, Montpelier was not a fragile artifact requiring delicate care. It was a canvas waiting for expansion. Under their ownership, the house began changing rapidly, adopting new wings, elongated corridors, and reconfigured interiors that reflected the era's enthusiasm for opulence and architectural experimentation. Stucco was applied over the historic brick to give the facade a lighter appearance, aligning it with contemporary stylistic preferences. Rooms were added and reshaped, ceilings heightened, and new service areas introduced to accommodate an estate lifestyle far removed from that of the Madisons. With each renovation, the house grew larger, so large, in fact, that by the time the work was complete, Montpelier boasted an extraordinary 55 rooms. The once distinctive symmetry of Madison's carefully planned residence now served as the core of a sprawling mansion whose footprint extended far beyond anything the founding father had envisioned. For the DuPonts, the estate was not merely a home, but a domain, complete with equestrian facilities, hunting landscapes, and social spaces designed for lavish gatherings that echoed the traditions of European country life. Marion DuPont, who eventually inherited Montpelier, further imprinted her identity on the estate. A devoted horsewoman and a leading figure in American equestrian circles, she shaped the property into a hub of sporting activity. New barns and stables appeared across the grounds, and the surrounding fields transformed into training areas and racetracks. Inside the house, Marion added touches that blended sophistication with the boldness of modern design. Her Art Deco music room, with its mirrored walls, chrome accents, and streamlined forms, looked almost futuristic within the sprawling mansion, creating a striking contrast with the estate's 18th century origins. Despite the grandeur and ambition of the DuPont renovations, the original Montpelier became increasingly difficult to discern beneath the layers of 20th century change. The walls still held the quiet memory of the Madisons, but those echoes were now faint, overshadowed by expansions built to satisfy a different era's tastes. Visitors walking through the massive estate encountered sweeping spaces of opulent scale, yet the early structure lay buried inside, present but obscured, its historical significance muffled by decades of reimagining. Still, the DuPont era preserved something vital. Montpelier remained intact, protected from the slow decay that had threatened it in the 19th century. Though transformed almost beyond recognition, the estate survived because the family valued it enough to maintain and inhabit it. And even as their sweeping changes distanced the house from its Madison-era appearance, they also ensured it would not collapse into ruin or fade into obscurity. By the time the estate passed to the next generation and eventually approached transfer to public stewardship, Montpelier stood at a curious intersection of preservation and reinvention. Its vast wings and modernized interiors represented one narrative, while the hidden core, still present, still structurally sound, held the potential for rediscovery. What no one yet realized was that the greatest transformation was still to come. Montpelier, a house reshaped almost beyond recognition, was on the verge of the most ambitious restoration in American architectural history. a project that would peel back the layers added over more than a century and uncover the original heart of the home, dormant but waiting to return. Among the many transformations Montpelier experienced under the DuPont family, none captured the estate's evolving identity more strikingly than the room Marion DuPont crafted in the bold language of Art Deco. This single space, set within a mansion whose origins trace back to the 18th century, embodied a fascinating tension. A modernist jewel nested inside a home once shaped by the orderly symmetry of the early republic. It was here, between mirrored walls and polished chrome accents, that the estate's layered history revealed itself most vividly. The rest of the mansion, expanded into a sprawling 55-room complex, retained the genteel character of a country estate, yet Marion's Art Deco room broke completely from tradition. Entering it felt like stepping into an entirely different narrative, one that shimmered with theatricality and a sense of daring far removed from the world of James and Dolly Madison. Glass blocks softened and refracted light. Sleek lines replaced the ornamentation of previous eras, and the room's geometry created a rhythm that seemed almost kinetic. A ceiling-mounted weather vane, an eccentric flourish of Marion's own imagination, rotated gently with the breeze, signaling direction as though the entire home itself were turning towards something new. This vibrant chamber, with its mirrored surfaces and bold materials, contrasted sharply with the deeper, quieter spaces that still carried traces of the Madison era, buried beneath layers of 20th century expansion. The original rooms, some hidden behind later additions, others disguised beneath stucco and new finishes, felt like silent witnesses, watching as modernity asserted itself with confidence. If the old heart of Montpelier whispered of political theory, early American ideals, and genteel intellectual life, the Art Deco room sang of speed, freedom, and the exhilarating momentum of change. Marion herself embodied this duality. A pioneering figure in American equestrian sport, she possessed both reverence for tradition and an appetite for innovation. Her estate became a world where foxhounds, thoroughbreds, and distinguished guests shared space with sleek modern furnishings and architectural experiments. She was not simply a custodian of Montpelier. She was an active force shaping it into a reflection of her passions, her lifestyle, and her era. Visitors who walked from the older sections of the mansion into Marion's room experienced a jarring yet captivating shift in atmosphere. One moment, they were surrounded by the muted tones and classical proportions of an 18th century home. The next, they found themselves enveloped in reflective surfaces and contemporary flair. The juxtaposition was not accidental. Marion seemed to embrace the idea that Montpelier could hold multiple identities at once, that its past and present did not need to compete, but could coexist in a dynamic conversation across centuries. Yet, beneath the elegance and confidence of her renovations, a quieter truth lingered. Montpelier was still a house with an extraordinary past, one that risked being overshadowed by the layers built upon it. Marion loved the estate deeply, and she understood its significance far beyond personal use. She recognized that the home had once belonged to a man whose ideas shaped the nation, that its foundations were interwoven with stories far older than the DuPont presence, and that the land still held memories of lives whose contributions had never been fully acknowledged. As her years at Montpelier progressed, Marion began to contemplate the future of the estate with increasing clarity. She knew that her own chapter was only one part of a much larger story, and that the mansion's next transformation would need to honor a legacy far greater than any single generation could claim. Quietly, deliberately, she prepared a path that would soon shift Montpellier's destiny once again, this time not into the hands of another private owner, but toward a stewardship that would reveal a history the world had nearly forgotten. The brilliant surfaces of her Art Deco room reflected a woman who understood the value of reinvention. Yet the foundations of the house around her waited patiently for the moment when its true form would be rediscovered, restored, and recognized once more. As Marion DuPont grew older, the weight of Montpellier's legacy settled more heavily upon her. She understood better than anyone how drastically the estate had changed under her family's care. It had evolved from an 18th century plantation house into a vast country mansion, from a presidential residence into an equestrian haven, from a symbol of one era into a laboratory of another. Yet beneath all the expansions and transformations, Marianne could still sense the presence of the original structure, the quiet heart of James Madison's home, pulsing under layers of brick, stucco, and memory. She began to recognize that Montpellier's future could not depend on private ownership alone. The estate had grown too large, too complex, and too historically significant to risk drifting into decline again. More importantly, the stories embedded in its walls, stories of governance, transformation, conflict, and perseverance, deserved to be safeguarded by an institution capable of honoring every chapter, not just the most recent. Marianne, who had spent her life shaping the house according to her own passions, now sought to ensure that future generations would see Montpellier not as a backdrop for wealth or leisure, but as a national landmark whose full history must be preserved. Her decision took shape gradually, informed by years of reflection and by her awareness that she had no heirs who could carry the responsibility forward. As she considered the fate of the estate, she looked beyond her family, beyond Virginia, beyond the traditions of inherited property. She envisioned Montpellier becoming a place of education, research, and public engagement, an institution that would invite scholars, visitors, and descendants alike to walk through its halls and understand the intertwined lives that had shaped its past. This vision found a natural home in the National Trust for Historic Preservation, an organization with the capacity to steward Montpellier's vast acreage and shepherd its rebirth as a center of historical inquiry. With characteristic decisiveness, Marianne arranged for the estate, along with a significant endowment, to pass to the trust upon her passing. It was a gift that would not only secure the property's survival, but also initiate a new era of discovery and accountability. The estate that had once risen from frontier wilderness, endured political upheavals, and expanded under multiple generations, was now poised to enter a chapter defined by preservation rather than reinvention. When Montpellier formally transferred to the National Trust, a palpable shift occurred. Instead of focusing on modernizing or expanding the estate, preservationists and historians turned their attention backward, peeling through archival records, surveying the grounds, and inspecting the buildings for clues about their original forms. What had long been overshadowed by DuPont-era architecture and decades of alterations began to re-emerge. Researchers discovered traces of the early Madison layout beneath later additions. Archaeologists unearthed artifacts that revealed both the daily lives of the enslaved community and the evolution of the plantation economy. Structural experts identified which beams, bricks, and plaster sections belonged to Madison's world, and which belonged to the sprawling 20th century mansion layered on top. Early programs developed by the Trust focused on capturing these findings, creating educational opportunities, and reconnecting Montpellier to the broader history of the United States. Visitors, once drawn primarily to the DuPont equestrian legacy, now began learning about constitutional history, the operations of an 18th century plantation, and the immense contributions of the enslaved individuals who lived and labored on the property. For the first time, Montpellier's role as a site of both national achievement and profound human complexity was brought fully into the light. Yet, as valuable as these early initiatives were, they revealed something deeper. Montpellier could not merely be studied, it needed to be restored. The house, as it stood, was an architectural palimpsest, obscuring the original Madison-era design beneath layers of 20th century alterations. To truly understand the home as Madison knew it, those additions would have to be removed. It was a daunting prospect, one bordering on the unbelievable. Dismantle decades of DuPont expansions, strip away the stucco, recreate 18th and early 19th century craftsmanship, and rebuild Montpellier as it had stood during the most consequential years of Madison's life. As research deepened and evidence accumulated, the idea of a full restoration shifted from a distant dream into a serious undertaking. Specialists, historians, and architects began envisioning the process. Detailed plans were drafted. Funding strategies were explored. The National Trust prepared itself for a project unlike anything attempted in American historic preservation. Montpellier, after centuries of reinvention, stood on the brink of returning to its original identity. The stage was set for the reconstruction of the century, one that would peel back time, room by room, and reveal the house that had witnessed the birth of a nation. The moment the National Trust committed to restoring Montpelier to its 1820 appearance, the estate entered one of the most ambitious preservation efforts ever attempted in the United States. The project required not only technical mastery, but also the courage to dismantle decades of modifications, many of them beloved in their own right, and to peel back each architectural layer until the original Madison-era structure could breathe again. What followed was a process as meticulous as it was monumental, a kind of architectural archaeology that treated the house not as a static monument, but as a living archive waiting to be deciphered. The first and most dramatic phase involved the removal of the immense DuPont-era additions. These wings, which had expanded the mansion to an astonishing 55 rooms, represented an entire chapter of the estate's identity. Yet to reveal the historic heart of Montpelier, they had to go. The demolition was a careful operation, performed with respect rather than haste. Workers studied every wall before dismantling it, documenting layers of paint, plaster, and brick that offered clues about how the house had evolved over centuries. What remained after the expansions were stripped away was a remarkably smaller structure. Madison's Montpelier, now exposed but fragile, like the bones of a long-buried building finally emerging into light. Once the DuPont wings were removed, the restoration team turned to the exterior, where the stucco applied in the 20th century obscured the original brickwork. Removing it required delicate precision to avoid damaging the underlying masonry. As the stucco fell away, the estate's earliest craftsmanship reappeared. Flemish bond brick patterns, handmade mortar, and subtle variations in color that revealed where additions had been made between 1764 and 1820. For the first time in generations, the house regained the face it had shown during Madison's most active political years, a sober, elegant facade that reflected the values of the early republic. Inside, the restoration demanded an equally high level of historical detective work. Experts recovered plaster fragments containing traces of original pigments, allowing them to match paint colors accurately. Carpentry teams recreated 18th century molding profiles using hand tools similar to those used in Madison's time. Floors were refinished or rebuilt based on historical wear patterns, and hearths were reconstructed to match the fireplaces where Dolly once hosted guests and where Madison pored over political manuscripts. Every room became a study in authentic replication, guided by surviving inventories, letters, and archaeological findings. Meanwhile, attention turned to the landscape. The gardens and grounds, heavily modified during the DuPont years, were reinterpreted based on early 19th century maps, travelers' descriptions, and botanical evidence uncovered during soil analysis. Pathways were rerouted to restore long-lost sightlines toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. Beds of heirloom plants were arranged according to Dolly's original garden patterns, creating a landscape that mirrored the estate's appearance during the years when Madison retired from public office and returned to the rhythms of plantation life. The restoration, funded by a staggering $25 million, required a level of coordination rarely seen in preservation projects. Historians worked alongside architects, engineers collaborated with archaeologists, and craftspeople revived techniques that had nearly vanished from American building traditions. The process unfolded room by room, wall by wall, like a slow turning back of time. Visitors who witnessed it described the eerie sensation of watching the house shrink, clarify, and transform, not into something new, but something astonishingly old and familiar. Yet, as Montpellier's physical form returned to its Madison-era appearance, the restoration work exposed something deeper, a parallel history written not in bricks or plaster, but in the lives of the enslaved community whose labor had constructed and maintained the estate. Archaeological digs intensified during the restoration, unearthing objects that told the stories of individuals whose presence had long been overshadowed by presidential history. Pottery fragments, tools, personal items, and remnants of living quarters surfaced from the soil, offering intimate glimpses into daily existence for the people who had sustained the plantation's operations for generations. These discoveries revealed a narrative far more complex and far more painful than the architectural restoration alone could convey. The estate's polished new surfaces were now juxtaposed with evidence of struggle, resilience, and endurance buried just beneath them. The meticulous restoration, intended to honor Madison's legacy, had inadvertently illuminated the parallel world of those whose contributions had gone unacknowledged for centuries. Montpelier, once again whole, now stood not only as a restored presidential home, but also as a gateway to understanding the full, often difficult truth of its past. And as the archaeological findings continued to emerge, it became clear that the next chapter would confront that truth directly, reshaping the meaning of the estate in ways no previous generation had fully imagined. As Montpellier's restored walls returned to their early 19th century form, the soil beneath the estate began yielding stories that had waited centuries to be told. What lay hidden in the earth was not simply a collection of artifacts, but a second, parallel history, one that unfolded beside the lives of the Madisons, yet had been largely erased from public memory. Archaeologists working across the grounds soon realized that the restoration of the mansion had triggered something far deeper, a reckoning with the estate's full identity, shaped not only by presidential ideals, but by generations of enslaved people whose labor sustained every corner of the plantation. Excavations near the south yard, kitchen wing, stables, and tobacco fields revealed traces of housing structures long vanished from the landscape. Each post hole, each fragment of brick or charred wood, pointed to the daily lives of families who had lived in close proximity to the main house, yet had been systematically kept out of its narrative. Researchers uncovered ceramic shards repaired with metal staples, a sign of resourcefulness and care from individuals who preserved limited belongings across generations. Buttons, beads, pipe stems, handmade tools, utensils, and children's toys appeared from the soil, each item speaking to human presence, human adaptation, human survival. These discoveries allowed scholars to reconstruct the layout of the original slave quarters with remarkable precision. Archaeologists mapped out domestic yards, workspaces, hearths, storage pits, and pathways that once connected enslaved homes to the greater operations of the plantation. Slowly, the south yard reemerged as a living environment, one that had been integral to Montpellier's functioning, yet absent from its public image for nearly 2 centuries. Researchers used this growing body of evidence to guide the physical rebuilding of the quarters, reconstructing dwellings in their approximate forms and drawing directly from the materials, measurements, and architectural patterns unearthed on site. The return of these structures marked a profound shift in how Montpellier told its story. Instead of presenting a rose-tinted portrait of presidential life, the estate now committed itself to an honest representation of the world that had existed here, one where the ideals of liberty coexisted with forced labor. The culmination of this effort emerged in the groundbreaking exhibition, The Mere Distinction of Color, a project that reframed the estate through a lens grounded in truth, dignity, and inclusion. The exhibition occupied the very cellars of the mansion, the spaces closest to the earth that had preserved the stories of the enslaved community. In one section, voices of descendants, recorded, written, and woven into the displays, spoke directly to the legacy of slavery, challenging visitors to confront the human experiences behind historical abstractions. Another section examined the economics of enslavement across the nation, revealing how profits and political power were intertwined with a system that shaped the very foundations of the country. Names of the enslaved, once lost to incomplete records, were carefully gathered and presented. Family lineages were reconstructed, personal histories, where possible, were given context and voice. For descendants who returned to Montpellier to participate in this work, the experience was both emotional and empowering. They walked paths their ancestors had taken, stood inside the reconstructed quarters, and touched the walls of a house their families once maintained but could never claim as their own. Their involvement was not symbolic, it was foundational. The research, interpretations, and exhibitions grew from their perspectives, ensuring that Montpellier would speak truth, not just through artifacts, but through the people who carried its history and their lineage. This shift in stewardship toward honesty, inclusion, and accountability began to reshape the governance of the estate itself. Conversations that had once centered on preservation and architecture now turned toward justice, representation, and historical completeness. The Montpellier Descendants Committee, composed of individuals whose ancestors were enslaved on the property, gained an increasingly active role in decision-making. Their advocacy emphasized that Montpellier's legacy could not be authentic without their leadership and perspectives. What followed was unprecedented in American historic preservation. The estate formally restructured its governance to grant the Descendants Committee equal authority to the foundation that had long overseen operations. In an extraordinary moment of transformation, Montpelier, once a symbol of hierarchy and inequality, placed its future into the hands of those whose forebears had been denied agency on the same land. The estate's story no longer belonged solely to the Madisons, nor to the DuPonts, nor to historians. It now rested in the care of a community rising from the very people whose lives had been intertwined with the estate since its earliest days. Montpelier had reclaimed its voice, and through the voices of the descendants, it prepared to speak truths that had waited far too long to be heard. As Montpelier entered the 21st century, the estate began to shift from simply preserving history to actively reshaping it. The restoration of the mansion and the reconstruction of the slave quarters had reopened long silenced narratives, but an even more profound transformation was underway. One rooted not in architecture or archaeology, but in governance, representation, and justice. The estate, once a symbol of hierarchy and inequality, was preparing to undergo a reversal so significant that it would redefine not only its own legacy but also the broader landscape of historic preservation in America. For generations, decisions about Montpelier had been made by institutions far removed from the lives of those whose ancestors had labored here under coercion. Foundation boards, historians, and preservationists shaped the estate's public identity, interpreting its significance through the lens of political history, architectural evolution, and presidential biography. But as archaeological discoveries illuminated the depth and scale of the enslaved community's contributions, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. The estate's narrative was incomplete, its truth divided. The descendants of Montpellier's enslaved families, many of whom had been involved in research, oral history collection, and community outreach for years, understood this imbalance intimately. They carried generational knowledge passed down through stories, memories, and fragments of identity preserved despite the violent disruptions of slavery. Their involvement in the creation of the mere distinction of color had shown just how powerful their voice could be and how essential it was to the estate's integrity. But interpretation alone was not enough. For Montpelier to honor its full history, the descendants needed not only a platform, they needed shared authority. Negotiations began, sometimes quietly, sometimes publicly, between the Montpelier Foundation and the Montpelier Descendants Committee. The conversations were challenging, rooted in centuries of inequality, but propelled by a shared desire to build something new. Descendants argued not for symbolic gestures, but for structural change, representation at the highest level, decision-making power, and stewardship that matched the estate's ethical responsibilities. The Foundation, recognizing the urgency and historical necessity of this shift, moved toward a groundbreaking agreement. In 2021, after years of advocacy and collaboration, Montpelier formalized a governance model that granted equal authority to the Descendants Committee. Shortly afterward, Descendants achieved not just parity, but a majority voice, holding 14 of 25 seats on the governing board, including the chair. It was a moment that resonated far beyond the estate's boundaries. A plantation, once defined by the control of enslavers, was now guided by the descendants of those who had been forced to build and maintain it. This structural transformation did not erase the past. Instead, it reframed it. Montpelier became something rare in the landscape of American heritage sites, a place where the legacy of enslavement was not an addendum, but a central pillar of interpretation and stewardship. Public programs expanded to include descendant-led tours, community-centered events, and educational initiatives that foregrounded African American resilience, creativity, and historical experience. Exhibits were revised to emphasize interwoven histories rather than isolated narratives. Partnerships formed between scholars, civic leaders, and descendant families to explore previously unexamined facets of the estate's story. In this new era, Montpelier emerged as a model for ethical historic preservation. It demonstrated that acknowledging difficult histories does not weaken a landmark. It strengthens it by grounding its narrative in truth. Visitors no longer encountered a sanitized presidential estate, but a landscape that reflected the complex human realities that shaped the early United States. They learned not only about the constitutional contributions of James Madison, but also about the endurance of the people who lived in the quarters beyond the mansion walls, the labor that sustained the household, and the communities that persisted long after emancipation. For the descendants, stewardship of Montpelier represented more than administrative authority. It offered a form of reclamation, a way to honor ancestors whose lives had been recorded only through ledgers, bills of sale, and fragments of memory. In guiding the estate's future, they reclaimed a measure of autonomy denied to their families for generations. The land that once constrained their ancestors now offered a platform for education, empowerment, and healing. Under this shared leadership, Montpelier transformed into a living entity, an estate shaped as much by memory and justice as by architecture and landscape. The house, having survived centuries of upheaval, reinvention, and near collapse, entered a period of clarity. It could now present its history honestly, the triumphs and contradictions, the innovation and coercion, the intellect that shaped a nation and the labor that sustained it. Instead of being frozen in a single era, Montpelier embraced its full timeline, allowing visitors to walk through a narrative that spanned from its first foundations to its newest chapter. The mansion's restored brick walls, its re-established gardens, and the reconstructed quarters stood as physical reminders of an evolving dialogue between past and present. Through governance rooted in truth, Montpelier became more than a historic site. It became a testament to resilience, accountability, and the possibility of transformation across generations. And so, the story of Montpelier ends not with a closing door, but with an open one. The estate lives on as a place where history continues to unfold, not as a relic of what once was, but as a home reclaimed, reinterpreted, and renewed by those whose ancestors shaped it from the beginning.